We will now turn to our final speaker of the evening, Khadeja Shebani. Khadeja is a second-year undergraduate student reading law at Selwyn College. They won the right to speak through open audition. Khadeja, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to tell you more about the Arab Spring and why we fundamentally cannot regret its occurrence. It would be easy for me to stand here today and look at the difficulties happening across the MENA region and simply chalk those down to being a result of the Arab Spring revolutions and then conclude that the Arab Spring should therefore be regretted. It's harder, however, to recognise that the decades of poor leadership, dictatorship, the removal of constitutional rights are the reasons for the instability we see today. And any regrets for the Arab Spring because of these injustices to the millions who risked their lives in this movement. Firstly, I'd like to point out that this motion is in dire need of some definition. So what was the actual Arab Spring? It was a series of anti-government protests, people rising together to fight against dictators who have oppressed for decades on end, through brutality, torture, and silencing by any means necessary. The Arab Spring was a movement of self-determination, which is why I think it's so interesting that the final speaker says that they would never regret the Arab yielding for freedom. This was the Arab yielding for freedom. People were uniting against a shared trauma, against a mutual understanding that what is to come will not be easy, but it is better than to remain oppressed by a malicious dictator. What the proposition is not going to do today is repackage the fundamentals of this movement and take it away from the millions of people who fought for it and continue to fight for it till today. It is a movement which has cemented that the Arab people will no longer sit silently to the abuses of insane individuals who use fear and indoctrination to produce a compliant state. I'll be arguing two main points today. My first point is that we must recognise the true goal of the Arab Spring in order to fairly judge it. And my second point is that regret of the Arab Spring shifts blame away from the international community's subsequent failure and on the shoulders of those thousands who actually fought for it. First of all, I'd like to offer plenty of rebuttal. I think it would take full 10 minutes to do a rebuttal. I'll just do it quickly. So first, there's this common idea on the proposition team that there were other peaceful recourse. Why didn't they use social media? Why didn't they protest like they did in Saudi Arabia? First of all, Saudi Arabia, I don't want to repeat, but Saudi Arabia is completely incomparable to the position of countries like Libya, like Egypt, like Saudi, economically, financially, in every single avenue you can think of, they're completely different, so I won't be wasting time to compare them today. But I'd like to firstly say that to simply say that the Arab Spring was a spontaneous response denies the thousands of lives which were lost prior to and after. People have been fighting for years, decades, against these dictators, and the Arab Spring was not just a whim decision. It happened over years, and people will carry it on. I think there's also a big discussion on the proposition team that there must have been some sort of organised diplomatic response, and there has been. Gaddafi was in power for 42 years. There has been diplomatic response, and they haven't worked. What else are we supposed to do? The Arab Spring was the solution in this case. As a Libyan, I've grown up with a massive awareness of a country that's at the heart of the Arab Spring discussion, and that's why today I'll be grounding my debate in examples and references to my own home country. I'm going to zoom in on one example briefly out of the millions available, by the way. But first I'd like to highlight that it's ironic that Gaddafi spoke on a screen right behind me here many years ago now, in the Union. He spoke to the society of free speech, a society which his morals and values were fundamentally against. He was a glorified murderer. He wiped freedom of thought, speech, and living in any way he could. A prime example of this, and the one I'll be discussing today, is the public execution of the martyr Sadiq Hamad al-Shuwaihdi in Benghazi, Libya in 1984. Sadiq Hamad al-Shuwaihdi was a Libyan student, an engineer who had just come back from studying in America. He joined his friends who were protesting in an airport in Libya, in Benghazi. And my mother actually describes the day it happened all very vividly. She remembers it being a Ramadan night, and my family were breaking their fast, listening to the call of prayer on TV. And the call of prayer was then swiftly cut to a live broadcast of the stadium in which Shuwaihdi was being hung. The stadium was packed with students, much like ourselves, high school students, university students, and they were purposely put there to remind them of what would be their fate if they thought they could educate themselves and reach levels and try to ever protest the government. This was more than just a single murder. It was a message to all Libyans of what would happen to them if they thought they could become smart enough and try to protest the government. And I could have used any other example of Gaddafi's torture to his own people, but the reason this one is so powerful is because it represents a shift. One towards silence, compliance, and absolute acceptance that anything Gaddafi did was right. And understanding the gravity of examples like this one, like the millions of others which happened across the countries prior to their revolutions, is necessary to understanding why the Arab Spring cannot be regretted. I cannot regret the removal of a dictatorship that risked the lives of millions, killed thousands of my own people, and subjugated my own family to arbitrary imprisonment and constant fear of torture and death. My first point for today will be how we must recognise the true goal of the Arab Spring in order to fairly judge its success or failure. The goal of the Arab Spring was to protect citizens faced with an impending fear of massacre led by tyrants, rather than it being to instantly establish a brand new government and rebuild a state and make it a utopia, for example. The Arab Spring removed the immediate threat, that was Muammar Gaddafi, and for that I see as a success. To paint a picture of the importance of the Arab Spring when it happened in Libya in 2011, the regime responded to protest movement with lethal force. They killed more than 100 people in the first few days. Gaddafi went on TV and made a speech, an infamous speech, in which he called the protesters cockroaches. He vowed to cleanse Libya of them, shibr shibr, bit bit, dar dar, zenga zenga. Translating to inch by inch, house by house, room by room, street by street. I remember vividly hearing this. I was like, what, in year 4? I remember repeating it, and they made it into a song as well. It's crazy. But by the time the intervention came around, the death toll was already estimated at almost 2,000 people. This was not the first time Gaddafi's killed a significant number of his own people. He ordered the massacre of 1,267 people in the space of a single hour in the Absn prison in 1996. Prisoners had been complaining of maltreatment, bad conditions, one piece of bread per day, no healthcare, no visits, calls, anything like that. They were becoming ill and spreading diseases to one another because of the lack of care at any level. They began to protest, and you can probably guess what happened next. They were all killed. Till this day, there are no graves, nor do we or their families know where their bodies even are. The reason that this is so important to outline is that Arabs were fed up. They had had enough of being subjugated to this oppression and this constant fear of being kidnapped in the middle of the night because they were suspected of forming some non-existent society. I do not regret that my people had the courage to fight against this, knowing that the risk of failing would have resulted in the death of anybody who took part. I do not regret that my people had the courage to end a regime which had continued for decades. We all accept that mistakes were made, but to reduce this to an absolutely regretful event is factually incorrect. What would the alternative have been? Ask yourself now, what would you have done if you had finally been given the opportunity to fight for your freedom? Or should we expect millions of Arabs to have continued to accept the status quo and another decade of oppression, violence? I say enough is enough, and that's what thousands of people said as well. The reality is that when people speak of the failures of the Arab Spring, they are speaking about what happened after it. And the responsibility of the failures here lies in the hands of individuals who attempted to use the recent events for their own gain. Whether this was through corruption or bad intentions in leadership, this fueled the instability and lack of trust in a country that was already just recovering from decades of brutal dictatorship. My second point is that now that we have established that the meaning of the Arab Spring is the initial movement which had been slowly rising to boiling point for some time prior to the actual start date of the Arab Spring, regret of the Arab Spring shifts blame away from the international community's subsequent failure to help defend and rebuild the shattered country, and instead puts blame and regret all on the shoulders of the Arabs who risked their lives to fight against brutal regimes. This makes it all the more important to distinguish between the Arab Spring itself, the movement of self-determination, like I said, and the international community's subsequent failure, a failure that nearly all the relevant actors acknowledge, by the way, to plan and act for the day after and help the victims of brutal dictatorship rebuild their countries. Measures would have included sending training missions to help the Libyan army restructure itself, or even sending multinational peacekeeping forces, which wasn't done until multiple years after the Arab Spring. Big players like the US could have restrained their allies from excessive meddling in the lead up to the civil wars which broke out after the Arab Spring in countries like Libya. And in the case of Libya again, Obama himself would eventually admit his failure to stay engaged. He said, as if this is a very simple topic, "I think we and our European partners underestimated the need to come in full force if you're going to do this." Yes, you did. For more than 4 decades, Gaddafi did everything in his power to preempt any civil society organizations or real autonomous institutions from emerging. He was paranoid about competing centers of influence. Gaddafi reduced the Libyan army to a personal fiefdom. Have you ever heard of a country that hasn't got an army? Libya was that country. Unlike other Arab aristocracies, the state and the leader were inseparable. This is similar to the case of Syria, in which Bashar al-Assad has consistently stated that he has no moderate opposition to his government, and simultaneously that all opposition forces are jihadists focusing on destroying his current leadership. Does this tell us that there was no opposition to these dictators prior to the Arab Spring? Definitely not. What I do not want is the proposition to wipe away those thousands of voices that have been fighting for decades on end. There are thousands of stories that will never reach the public. Thousands of people who have risked their lives during and prior to the Arab Spring, which will never surface, and I am here to say that those lives have not been lost for nothing. The reality is that the faults we see in the Arab Spring are as a result of decades of dictatorship, weakening a country so far that rebuilding will take more time, and it would be absurd to expect any different from nations fresh from decades of tyrannical rule. To conclude, just as these dictators had oppressed for decades on end, it will take more time to rebuild the fundamentals of countries that had become so lost. The proposition must not force their own countdown timer and impose regret on the people who simply practiced their right to self-determination and freedom from torture in the Arab Spring. We must ask ourselves once again, who are we to impose that a people must be regretful when the majority of us can't even fathom to live a single day under such dictatorship? Thank you very much.